It's a great pleasure to welcome Stefanie Weigele, who is a Berlin-based graphic designer, author and calligrapher, specialising in historical and contemporary pointed pen scripts. And she's going to speak to us today on current script.
Thanks so much for introducing me, and hello. And yeah, I'm going to talk about Kurrent script, which is I'll talk about this in a moment. Sorry. Okay. A little bit about myself, because I'm not from academic background. I studied at art school, graphic design, and so after a career in advertising, and I work now mainly as a calligrapher in the last 10 years. You'll find me online at federfruit.com. I've been specializing in, well, I said that already, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous, to be honest. So I'm teaching, researching, and I do commercial work. So my background is really hands-on and practical, but I've always been strongly interested in the history and theory of what I do. And I'm truly honored to be speaking here today at this conference, which is very inspiring for me. It's this huge range of different topics. An important step in my career as a calligrapher was writing and designing my book about pointed pen calligraphy, with a main focus on English roundhand or copperplate. It was published in German in 2019. Then it got translated into Japanese in 2020, and just this year in spring in English also. It does not only teach how to write copperplate calligraphy, but also deals extensively with its history and development. Also, I included some other historical and modern script styles in the book, which brings me to today's topic, which is Kurrent script, an aesthetic evolution. In this talk, I'll explore how and why the visual appearance of Gothic handwriting styles, or better to say, handwriting styles in a Gothic style, because they are all later than the epoch we call Gothic. Specifically, Kurrent script in Northern Europe, how it changed over the course of the last 4 centuries. Please note that I use largely calligraphic or typographic terms to describe letter types, because that is what I learned and know best. These designations tend to differ a bit, and sometimes a lot, from paleographic nomenclature. I use the words informal or cursive a bit erratically, and I beg to excuse this because this is a work in progress. Yeah. So, with this in mind, and that my perspective is that of a practicing calligrapher, I'll start. This is how Kurrent looked like in its first formal rendition in 1555 by Johann Neuwerfer, whose master scribe book is called Eine gute Ordnung, meaning a good order of letters, etc., of course. And he explains visually on this page how the letters are formed by combining basic pen strokes, before he shows an alphabet with letter variations and how the letters are actually connected. So this is the connecting parts, the single stroke parts, and the single letters. This is an example of the alphabet that is also called Kurrent, from roughly 300 years later, in a copybook by a German calligrapher and teacher named Jäger. You'll agree that on first glance, the letters look quite different from the first example. And on the very first slide of this presentation, you saw a variation of Kurrent by myself, very recent example. However, before I go any further, let me give you a brief overview of the content of my actual talk. I'll start with a clarification of terms. Then I'll ask where Kurrent fits in the greater scope of the history of European writing styles. And then, most importantly, I'm going to explore how changes in society, intercultural influences, and not least tools and technologies shaped the look of Gothic handwriting styles in Northern Europe from around 1550 until today. The main focus will be on German Kurrent script because, unlike, for example, Danish, Icelandic, or Norwegian, I can read the original sources in German. Lots of exemplary documents will hopefully make this a pleasant and interesting exploration for you. So let's start to clarify. Kurrent comes from the Latin currere, which means to run, to race, to flow, which most of you know probably. Okay, so which means that in a very simple sense, Kurrent script is something done quickly. It's a running or flowing form of writing. What we today would probably just call handwriting. We just heard a lot about handwriting, which was very interesting too. Before the invention of the printing press and of movable type, of course, generally speaking, all kinds of text were handwritten, or cut, or painted. Among other factors like tools and materials, the degree of formality is what mainly created the visual distinction of different kinds of scripts within one culture and time. And then I'm really a bit out of my depth here, but I'm going to show you some tips. Just as an example of very formal writing, opposed to informal Egyptian writing. In the book I found this was called demotic. I'm not sure if it's hieratic. I'm sorry. Correctly. So I found this important because many people and I grew up with this idea of how Roman writing and document storage looked like. Of course, it wasn't like this. There were the very formal capitalis monumentalis used on monuments. On the left, the very famous Trajan capitalis monumentalis, and on the right is a. I'm sorry, I lost myself a little bit. I'm sorry. Okay, on the right we have a Roman cursive that was used for everyday documents. Yeah, it is important to ask when we look at script, what was it made for? Do we look at a trader's account, a holy scripture, a philosopher's private notes, or do we look at something very private or very public? So, on the right, in the classical Roman chancery cursive, you can see that, like in the Egyptian contract, there are a lot of letter variations, differences in size, shape, and overall irregularities. These letters are not so impressive in appearance as the formal capitalis letters on the left. They possess a clearly defined and carefully designed aesthetic. That has, of course, a reason, and here I would like to quote Father Petter's observation, who researched the origin of capitalis monumentalis in his book Origin of the Serif. And he said that formal letters favor the need of the eye that reads, whereas informal favor the hand that makes the letters. Speed of writing then is a chief cause for the shift from formality to informality in a calligrapher's writing. Let's keep that in mind. Over the course of the next 1500 years, an astonishing number of Latin writing styles came and went. Some were of remarkably restrained elegance, deceivingly simple, even modern looking, others most lavishly decorated. Sometimes little annotations, often translations, in many cases added centuries later, can be found in a simpler script alongside the main text. Some documents were carefully designed and written, and others hastily scribbled. The styles split up in regional variants, intertwining, influencing, and transforming one another, and many got bastardized and reformalized over the years. Due to time constraints, I'm going to skip this history largely, as fascinating as I find it. Around the year 1500, two major lines of script styles had established themselves over the continent and Great Britain. On the left, two examples that we still more or less unchanged, especially the printed type used today, every day. Roman-style alphabets that evolved in Italy during the early Renaissance after the rediscovery of Carolingian minuscule, combining it with classical Roman capitalis. They were called Latin in many regions of the time and had spread successfully from Italy all over Europe. On the other hand, here on the right, there were Gothic or blackletter alphabets. Nobody called them actually so back then. Like Roman alphabets, blackletter existed in formal, semi-formal, and informal versions. and write both formal examples above the Venetian Renaissance Antiqua on the left and the Textura or Textualis on the right from the Gutenberg Bible. Sorry, were already printed. A lot of text production still happened like 1,000 years ago, simply with pen and ink on parchment or paper. On the bottom left is an exemplary beautiful manuscript by Calligrapher Cataneo, a master example for cancellaresca or Italian humanist handwriting. But on the right, we are back at Kurrent, a cursive of the Gothic type, here in the master scribe book by Wolfgang Fugger, reproduced as a woodblock print. These cursives are a huge group of scripts whose origin is difficult to pinpoint. To quote František Muzica, who wrote a big book about the Latin alphabet, the origin of Gothic cursive has not yet been fully clarified scientifically. Only a few examples of cursive writing from the final phase of the early Middle Ages have survived, which is due more to the scarcity and high price of the writing material than to its low resistance or the subordinate importance of common written correspondence. Let's have a closer look at the Kurrent page we saw just. It contains a flourished initial, a headline in Fraktur, and the body copy in one version of Kurrent. The woodblock reproduced letters lack some details that the original will have possessed, but we can clearly see the defining traits of Gothic cursive script. Let me point out a few. The line spacing is relatively tight and the overall impression is stark. We have long descenders, very long descenders of both F and the long S, which even touch the next line of letters in some cases, like here. The capital letters are simplified versions of Fraktur capitals, which makes sense as Kurrent can be viewed as the handwriting equivalent of Fraktur. I've highlighted just a few here, like the I, T, M, A, and H. Most letter forms differ wildly from the humanist scripts of the time and from what we are used today, too. Then there is a typical zigzag pattern of N and U and all the letters that are derived from those. The only thing that differentiates the U and N is a curve that resembles an inverted comma. You can see here, this is a U, this is an N. As we will see, the zigzag pattern is a trait that will persist through the evolution of Kurrent, while other characteristics are going to change a lot. So how were these letters actually written? As I mentioned before, for hundreds of years, the most common writing tools and materials in Europe for simple writing were a bird quill as a pen, ink, and parchment, or since around 1200 also paper. Here are two rare illuminations that depict scribes working, one from around 1410, the other one from the early 12th century. On the left, we see author and calligrapher Christine de Pizan holding a quill in her right hand, and in her left hand, what might seem surprising, a quill knife, or a pen knife. The knife was not only used for cutting and trimming the pen, but also to hold down the parchment, which tends to bulge depending on air, humidity, and temperature. You can assume that the little box to the right of her was holding other instruments she used, like an ink jar, water jar, etc. On the right is the monk and calligrapher Erdwin. He describes himself in his portrait as the prince of scribes, and neither my praise nor fame shall die. Very unmodern, right? I think. Confused quill and knife even better, even more clearly. Honestly, when I saw this first, I thought she was left-handed, but oh my god, yeah, I got this wrong. The book that contains the illustration on the right is right here in Cambridge and Trinity College, by the way. So what kind of stroke does such a quill produce? That depends on how it is cut. Generally speaking, the typical cut for all scripts before early modern times was a broad cut, here depicted by Wolfgang Fugger in the book we saw before. Every writing tool with a broad cut leaves a very distinct trace, like a ribbon, which is why this stroke is also called Bandzug or ribbon stroke in German. Today we have a wide variety of tools at our disposal. Around 1500, it was mainly the quill, and for bigger scale letters, the reed pen. Both had to be dipped in ink after a few strokes. We saw this with the Egyptian reeds just in the break before. And both had to be maintained in good shape to produce clear, crisp-looking letters. That is why the penknife played such an important role. Quill wears out pretty quickly, even if it is lovely to write with. The broad pen ductus with its thin upstrokes and evenly thick downstrokes can be clearly seen here, even if the reproduction as woodcut printing is a bit rough. This page shows not one but 4 different Kurrent variants. Fugger calls them common. This is the first one, which is upright. Pushed, as this one is slanted to the right. Twisted, as the downstrokes are not straight, but have an S-curve-like appearance. And arched, as the letter N in this version doesn't have the typical zigzag form, but is curved. What I find remarkable about Fugger's book is that script teaching at this time seems to have been open to personal taste and less rigid than in many later copybooks. I quote, "There are 4 kinds of common and usual scripts, which are called Kurrenten, that can be written faster and easier by hand. Let everyone learn which one he wants and likes best. Everyone may change the letters in the future, how and in what form he wishes." And that is in fact what people did. From the 4 basic variants, Fugger presented the common version was the one that prevailed as the most used Kurrent at first. In this master scribe book by the Dutch calligrapher and teacher Maria Strick, who was extremely talented and renowned for her skill, you can see German Kurrent alongside 2 other regional cursives of the Gothic type of the early 1600s. They don't differ that much from one another in the lowercase letters. Here are the French and the English version. A closer look at the German Kurrent reveals that, like in Neudorfer's and Fugger's earlier examples, there are several variants for some minuscules, like for example the G. The script slant of Strick's Kurrent is also a bit variable. Sometimes it's vertical, sometimes with a slight slant to the right or to the left. The D still has an ascender to the left. The looped ascenders of B and H, however, start to slope to the right, like the long S and F did already. Okay. This is how Kurrent looked like in an engraved master scribe book. In practical use, it often was less immaculate. This is a wedding contract from Denmark, where Gothic handskrift was the official handwriting style taught in schools and used in administration until 1875. This is an original on vellum, as far as I can tell. It shows the peculiar way Latin script was mixed with regional Gothic cursives in the northern European countries. Dates, foreign terms, texts in Roman languages, and sometimes proper names and scientific texts were written in Latin. In that case, the date, July 6 and 1648. It shows clearly what a fast script Kurrent was. All the loops and connections between letters made a continuous, speedy flow possible, but at the expense of optimal readability. While the 16th century can be seen as the golden age of calligraphy and penmanship in Italy, the 17th in the Low Countries, and then in France, with many very talented engravers and scribes working together to produce copybooks of the highest quality. It was in the 18th century that the influence of English scribes became most prominent with the development of English shorthand. You know it when you see it. It's what most people today call copperplate calligraphy on the left, a sample alphabet with the typical classicist stroke contrast, on the right a flourished header and a signature. Of course, these scribes wanted to show off their skill too. But it was because of its promise of relative simplicity and legibility of the actual letters across borders, because many Gothic scripts were so regional that people outside its respective borders couldn't read it easily, that English shorthand started slowly to replace the handwriting styles of the Gothic type. I mention it here because even if copperplate is obviously not a Gothic type script, it had a huge impact on the appearance of Kurrent. It became more slanted in its overall look. As the Anglaise, how the English shorthand was called in France and Germany, got fashionable in the rest of Europe. Also, letters like D that were left slanting before are now right-leaning. Another crucial thing that happened in the course of the 18th century is that some scribes started to switch from using a broad pen to a pointed, flexible one. A flexible pointed pen tip, regardless if it's a quill, a steel nib, or even a round pointed brush, produces a hairline without pressure and a swell stroke when pressure is applied. Pointed, flexible quills have been used before, but mostly for flourishing or ornate capitals, like these ones from 1736. In this copybook from nearly 100 years later, Franz Petter shows the different cuts he recommends for chancery and fraktur, both the traditional broad pen cut, as well as for French and English crossleaf, a very thin broad cut, probably flexible as the slit is very long, and finally a true pointed tip for German Kurrent and flourishing. It is explicitly mentioned that fat downstrokes are produced by applying pressure. Using pointed nibs for general writing had a big advantage. You could write different sized letters with the same pen. Before that, you needed a special quill for each size and style. The downside is that it is more difficult to write with consistently thick downstrokes. So the look of the, wrong direction. While the look of the specimens in the copybooks in the 19th century became ever more refined and uniform, and honestly even harder to read, because the line spacing increased, while the X height increased even more. Note here also the contrast between the Latin/English style letters that are bigger in size and much easier to read, not only because of the unfamiliarity of the Kurrent letter forms. The poet Goethe's fluid handwriting from 1802 shows again that Kurrent is a script that favors the hand that writes. It looks nice enough in its flow, but it's really hard to read. I'm pretty sure he used a pointed quill, because the lines are of uniform thickness and without a clear stroke contrast, he did not press hard down on the pen. It may have been typical calling for the good old days, or the fact that, of course, writing wasn't the elite and professional thing it had been some 100 years ago. There were lots of complaints that everyday writing seems to have declined somewhat in quality. Here, a parcel label from 1842 with a wild mix of handwriting types. The invention of the steel pen in the early 1820s was another shock for many of the more conservative teachers. But a grievance was uttered about the unpleasant writing experience it offered. Probably the first steel pen nibs were really not as nice to write with. They were stiffer, colder, and sharper than its organic predecessor, the quill. Still, by the end of the 19th century, it seems to have become the main writing instrument, and I guess the bane of uncountable school children. As lovely as I personally find writing with a pointed pen, it's a difference if it is a choice to use it for a more artistic writing expression or as an everyday thing forced upon kids. So the call for writing reforms grew louder, and in Germany it led to the radical simplification of Kurrent and to another change of the tool and the stroke. The monoline stroke is the last of the three basic strokes I'm going to discuss here. Historically, it was probably the first, when some early human being simply scratched a line in the sand with a stick, or maybe on a rock, like we have seen in the fascinating talk about Bedouin writing. So this is basically a simple line of more or less unchanging thickness in its Platonic idea. It's typical for modern everyday handwriting, but in many cultures the earliest script examples also show this stroke. It can also be used for drawing and for hand lettering, of course. Monoline writing tools have a rigid round tip, be it a radius nib, a marker, or a fountain pen. There were several attempts to simplify the learning of writing in schools. The one that made it as the mandatory handwriting style for pupils in Germany was developed by Ludwig Sütterlin. Here's the Latin version. Again, kids had to learn both Kurrent and Latin script. And here's the German Kurrent version. The contrast to the former exemplars couldn't be more extreme. There is no stroke contrast anymore. Because a radius nib which produces a monoline was used to write. The downstrokes are now vertical instead of slanted. The line spacing is tight but not overlapping. But the most striking feature is probably that for the minuscules, the ratio of the X height to the descenders to the ascenders is set at 1:1:1. It's up there in the top You can see it's 3 lines of equal distance. So this is a very compressed but legible script. So Sütterlin's Kurrent was used for all kinds of design purposes, often in connections with learning to write and to read, and was also produced as a typeface, or in this example, lettered, here for a children's book title. It surely was not a very elegant nor very adult script, and it wasn't meant to be. Sütterlin himself said, "Our new letters want to be nothing more than simple models for the initial lessons, which place only minor demands on the child's ability to grasp and visualize. They are a basis for the further development of fluent, beautiful, and clear handwriting." In a sense, this is where the circle closes. Like Wolfgang Fugger nearly 400 years ago, there is a clear emphasis on the option or even need to develop a personal handwriting style. It also closes because in 1941, all Gothic letter styles were forbidden in Germany by the Nazi regime. Which is strange in a way, because in the 19th century, Kurrent was propagated by Teutonic nationalist movements. So a little tact and consideration in the use of the Kurrent script is a good idea. While Kurrent is today largely forgotten, there are not many people who can read or write it. In recent years, some calligraphers and lettering artists started to rediscover its visual potential. Here's a very compelling work for a literature festival by Hamburg-based lettering artist Chris Campbell. She combines Kurrent elements like the zigzag of the Mindy schools, the form of R and D with Latin letter forms that make it possible to decipher the codes without knowing Kurrent. The design process is started with analog pencil drawings and then got translated to digital outlines that were cut finally in vellum. So in conclusion, Kurrent is an exciting and resilient perceived script that has endured for centuries, despite aesthetic adaptations to the taste of time and changes due to new writing techniques and social demands. Although Kurrent no longer has any significance as an everyday script today, it deserves to be used and reinterpreted on suitable occasions because of its interesting visual quality. In addition, learning Kurrent or another Gothic cursive such as English secretary hand makes it possible to study documents dating further back in time. For practicing calligraphers, Kurrent is also an interesting addition to their repertoire, like for myself. So, thank you very much.